On the morning of August 14, 2003, Sheriff Marcus Wendell arrived at the Triple Diamond Ranch outside Carrizo Springs, Texas, to find 13 men bound with barbed wire to the fence posts along County Road 17. The temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees. Some of the men had been there since midnight. Their wrists and ankles bore deep lacerations where they had struggled against the wire. 2 would lose fingers to infection. 1 would never regain full use of his left hand. The men who did this were twin brothers named Coleman and Curtis Mackey, 61 years old, fourth-generation ranchers who had worked the same 3,000 acres their great-grandfather claimed in 1882. Their crime began over a single gate left open on a Wednesday afternoon, a gate worth maybe $200 to replace, a gate that had been in the Mackey family for 70 years. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe. Carrizo Springs sits in Dimmit County, where the Mesquite Flats meet the brush country, and the land runs hard and dry under a sun that forgives nothing. By 2003, the town had been declining for 20 years. The oil boom that kept it alive through the 70s had faded to memory. Main Street showed more empty storefronts than open businesses. The movie theater had closed in '96. The implement dealer went under in '99. Young people left for San Antonio or Houston and rarely came back. What remained were the old ranching families, the ones who had been there since before Texas was a republic, men and women who measured wealth not in dollars but in water rights and fence line and the ability to look a neighbor in the eye. The air always carried the smell of dust and creosote. In summer, the heat pressed down like a hand on your chest. In winter, the north wind came straight down from the plains with nothing to stop it. The landscape was all thorn and stone, land that demanded respect and gave back only what you earned through sweat and patience and an understanding that this place would kill you if you made one mistake too many. Coleman and Curtis Mackey were born 11 minutes apart in March of 1942 in the same bedroom where their father had been born and their grandfather before him. They were identical twins, though anyone who knew them could tell them apart after 5 minutes. Coleman was the talker, the one who handled the business side, who went to the bank and dealt with the feed suppliers and kept the books. Curtis was quieter, more comfortable with cattle and horses than people, the one who could read weather in the sky and knew every draw and tank and stretch of fence on the property. They had worked together their entire lives. They had never married. They lived in the ranch house their great-grandfather built, a low stone structure with thick walls and small windows designed to keep out the heat. The house sat on a rise overlooking the main pasture. Every morning they woke at 5. Curtis made coffee while Coleman checked the weather radio. They ate breakfast in silence, eggs and bacon and tortillas, and then they went to work. Their routine had not changed in 40 years. They drove the same 1978 Ford truck their father had bought new. They wore the same style of boots and hats. They used tools that had belonged to their grandfather. The ranch was their identity, their purpose, the only thing that mattered. They had no children to leave it to, but that did not diminish their sense of duty to the land and to the name scratched into the stone above the front door. The gate that would destroy their lives stood where County Road 17 met the ranch's eastern boundary. It was made of welded pipe, painted green, though the paint had long since faded to gray and rust. The gate had hung there since 1933 when their grandfather installed it. It was not the original gate on that spot, but it was old enough to carry weight, old enough that Coleman and Curtis remembered their father teaching them how to open and close it properly, how to lift and swing it so the hinges did not bind. The gate opened onto a dirt track that ran 3 miles back to the house. No one had any business using that gate except the Mackeys. The main entrance was 2 miles south on the highway. But the county had paved Road 17 in the 90s, and suddenly people started using it as a shortcut. Hunters mainly, men from San Antonio or Corpus Christi who came down in the fall looking for deer or javelina. They would see the dirt track and think it led somewhere public. They would open the gate and drive through and leave it open behind them. Coleman had put up signs: no trespassing, private property, keep gate closed. It did not matter. Every few months he would drive out and find the gate standing open and tire tracks heading back toward the house. In July of 2003, a group of men from Laredo started hunting the state land that bordered the Triple Diamond to the north. There were 7 of them, cousins and brothers, men in their 30s who worked construction and came out to the brush country on weekends. They were not bad men. They were not looking for trouble. But they were careless. The first time they left the gate open, Coleman found it the next morning. 60 head of cattle had wandered out onto the county road. It took him and Curtis 6 hours to round them up. 1 cow had been hit by a truck and had to be put down. Coleman drove into town and filed a complaint with the sheriff. The sheriff said he would look into it. Nothing happened. 2 weeks later, the gate was open again. This time, no cattle got out, but Coleman was furious. He drove to the state land and found the hunters and told them in clear language to use the highway entrance like everyone else. The men apologized. They said they did not know it was private. Coleman accepted their apology and drove home. The third time it happened was on a Wednesday in early August. Curtis found the gate open at noon. He closed it and called Coleman on the radio. Coleman drove out to the state land. The hunters were there, sitting in the shade of their trucks, drinking beer. Coleman asked them why they kept opening his gate. One of the men, a thick-shouldered guy with a goatee, laughed and said it was just a gate. No big deal. He said maybe Coleman should get a lock if he was so worried about it. The other men laughed too. Coleman stood there in the heat with his hands at his sides and felt something break loose inside him. He was 61 years old. He had worked this land every day of his life. He had never asked for anything except to be left alone and to be treated with the basic respect one man owed another. He turned and walked back to his truck. He did not say another word. That evening, Coleman and Curtis sat on the porch as the sun went down. They did not speak for a long time. Finally, Coleman said they could not let it go. Curtis nodded. He said if they did nothing, then everyone would think they were weak, that the Mackey name meant nothing anymore. They talked about calling the sheriff again, but they both knew it would not matter. The law did not care about an open gate. The law did not understand what that gate represented. They talked about building a new gate with a lock, but that felt like surrender, like admitting the world had changed and they had to change with it. They were too old to change. They were too proud. Coleman said there was another way. Curtis asked what he meant. Coleman said they could make an example, something people would remember, something that would make it clear you did not disrespect a man's property without consequences. Curtis looked out at the dark land and thought about their father and their grandfather and all the men who had stood on this porch and made hard decisions because hard decisions were what the land required. He said he was with Coleman no matter what. They shook hands. They did not discuss details. They did not need to. They had worked together so long they moved like one mind and 2 bodies. The next Saturday the hunters came back. Coleman and Curtis knew they would. The men always hunted on weekends. The twins waited until dark and then drove out in the old truck with the lights off. They parked a quarter-mile away and walked through the brush, carrying coils of barbed wire and a pair of fence pliers. The moon was near full, and the land glowed silver and black. They could hear the hunters laughing around a campfire. Coleman counted 7 men. They waited until the fire died and the men climbed into their trucks to sleep. It was after midnight when Coleman and Curtis moved in. They did not rush. They worked methodically, the way they did everything. They opened the first truck door and pulled the man out before he was fully awake. They wrapped his wrists with barbed wire and walked him to the fence line. They secured him to a post and moved to the next truck. The men started yelling, but there was no one to hear them. The nearest house was 5 miles away. Coleman and Curtis worked in silence. When a man struggled, they hit him hard enough to stop the struggle, but not hard enough to knock him out. They wanted the men awake. They wanted them to understand. It took them 2 hours to bind all 7 men to the fence posts along the county road. Then they went back to the state land and found 6 more men sleeping in tents and campers. These were friends of the original group, men who had driven down Friday night. Coleman and Curtis bound them the same way. 13 men in total, strung along 100 yards of fence, their wrists and ankles wrapped tight with barbed wire, the sharp points digging in every time they moved. Coleman stood in the road and looked at what they had done. He felt no satisfaction, no anger, just a deep, tired sense that this was necessary, that the code he lived by demanded it. Curtis asked if they should call the sheriff. Coleman shook his head. He said someone would find them in the morning. They drove home and washed the blood off their hands and went to bed. At dawn, a rancher driving to town saw the men on the fence and called 911. Sheriff Wendell arrived 20 minutes later with 2 deputies and an ambulance. The men were cut down and taken to the hospital in Carrizo Springs. Most had lacerations on their wrists and ankles. 2 had gone into shock from blood loss. The doctors treated them and called the county prosecutor. By noon, the story was all over town. By evening, it was on the news in San Antonio. The reporters called it the Texas Barbed Wire Massacre, though no one had died. Coleman and Curtis were arrested without incident. They were sitting on the porch when the sheriff arrived. They did not resist. They did not deny what they had done. Coleman said the men had disrespected their property and their family, and this was the consequence. The sheriff shook his head and said it was not the 1880s anymore. You could not just take the law into your own hands. Coleman said the law had not done anything when he asked for help. The sheriff did not have an answer for that. He put them in handcuffs and drove them to the county jail. They were charged with 13 counts of kidnapping and assault. The prosecutor wanted to charge them with attempted murder, but could not make it stick. The bail was set at $500,000 each. Neither brother could make bail. They sat in jail for 9 months waiting for trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution brought in each of the 13 men to testify. They showed pictures of the wounds, medical records documenting nerve damage and infection. They argued that Coleman and Curtis Mackey were dangerous, that they had committed a brutal and premeditated attack over something as trivial as an open gate. The defense tried to argue provocation, tried to explain the cultural importance of property rights in ranching communities, tried to make the jury understand what it meant to have your boundaries violated again and again with no recourse. The jury did not care. They deliberated for 4 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Coleman and Curtis to 25 years each in state prison. They were 62 years old. They would likely die behind bars. At the sentencing hearing, the judge said he understood the frustration they must have felt, but that nothing justified what they had done, that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Coleman stood and said he would do it again. He said some things mattered more than freedom. The judge shook his head and ordered them taken away. Their lawyer filed an appeal, but it was denied. The ranch was sold to pay the legal fees and the civil judgments from the victims. A developer from Houston bought it for back taxes and subdivided it into ranchettes. The house was torn down. The gate was removed. Coleman Mackey died of a heart attack in Huntsville in 2009. He was 67. Curtis learned of his brother's death from a guard and did not speak for 3 days. He stopped eating. He lost 40 pounds in 6 weeks. The prison doctor said he was giving up, that his body was shutting down because his will was gone. Curtis Mackey died in his sleep 4 months after his brother. He was 67. Neither man ever expressed remorse. Their few remaining relatives buried them in the family plot outside Carrizo Springs, next to their parents and grandparents. The funeral was small. Most of the old ranching families were gone by then. The pastor spoke about the weight of legacy and the danger of pride. He did not condemn the brothers, but he did not praise them either. He said they had lived by a code that no longer fit the world, and the world had crushed them for it. If you drive out to where the Triple Diamond Ranch once stood, you will find a cluster of small houses on 5-acre lots, each with a metal barn and a pipe fence. The land looks the same, the mesquite and cactus and endless sky, but the feeling is different. The weight is gone. Where the old stone house stood, there is now a prefab home with vinyl siding. Where the main pasture rolled away to the horizon, there are surveyor stakes and gravel roads. County Road 17 is still there, paved and straight. If you know where to look, you can find the spot where the gate used to hang. There is nothing to mark it now, just a gap in the fence line that was filled in with barbed wire and cedar posts. The state land to the north is still open to hunters. On weekends you can hear gunshots echoing across the brush. No one remembers the Mackey brothers anymore, except as a strange and violent story from another time. The local high school did a project on the case a few years ago. The students interviewed some of the survivors. Most of the men said they had nightmares for years after. One said he still could not stand to see barbed wire. Another said he understood why the brothers did it, even though he could not forgive them. He said there was something about disrespecting a man's work, his legacy, that cut deeper than any wire. The students did not understand. They had grown up in a world where nothing was permanent, where property was just an investment, and boundaries were suggestions. They could not grasp what it meant to tie your identity to a piece of land, to believe that defending that land was worth any cost. The prosecutor who tried the case retired in 2012. In an interview, he said the Mackey case haunted him more than any other. He said he believed he had done the right thing, that the law had to mean something, but that he also understood the brothers were not criminals in any normal sense. They were men out of time, men who had lived too long and seen too much change. He said if the case had happened 50 years earlier, it might have been handled differently, quietly, between neighbors, without lawyers or reporters or prison sentences. But the world had moved on, and the Mackey brothers had not, and that gap swallowed them whole. One of the defense attorneys wrote an article about the case for a legal journal. He argued that the prosecution had been too harsh, that the judge should have shown more mercy, that 25-year sentences for old men with no prior record was effectively a death sentence. He pointed out that none of the victims had suffered permanent, life-threatening injuries, that the barbed wire had been a tool of humiliation rather than murder. But the law did not see it that way. The law saw kidnapping and assault and refused to consider context or culture or the slow erosion of a way of life that had once defined an entire region. Some people in Carrizo Springs still argue about whether Coleman and Curtis Mackey were victims or villains. The older generation, the ones who remember when ranching was everything, tend to sympathize even if they do not condone what the brothers did. They understand the rage that comes from being ignored, from watching the world you built with your hands get paved over and parceled out to strangers who do not know the first thing about the land. The younger generation sees it differently. They see two old men who brutalized 13 people because they could not accept that times had changed. They see pride and stubbornness taken to a monstrous extreme. Both views are true. Coleman and Curtis Mackey were shaped by a world that valued toughness and self-reliance and the defense of what was yours. They were taught that a man who would not stand up for his property was not much of a man at all. They were taught that respect was earned through action and that some insults demanded a response. Those lessons served them well for 6 decades. They worked the land and kept the ranch going through droughts and market crashes and all the slow, grinding difficulties that come with that life. They were respected. They were known as hard but fair, men who kept their word and expected the same from others. But the world shifted beneath them. The rules changed. What had once been seen as strength became cruelty. What had been justice became crime. They could not adapt. they could not let go, and so they made a choice that destroyed them. The gate itself, the object that started it all, was sold at auction along with the rest of the ranch equipment. A scrap dealer bought it for $30. It was cut up and melted down, its iron returned to the furnace, its history erased. No one thought to preserve it. No one saw it as anything more than junk. But for Coleman and Curtis Mackey, that gate was everything. It was continuity. It was the physical manifestation of their family's claim to the land. When their grandfather installed it in 1933, he was making a statement. He was saying, "This is ours, we have earned it, and we will defend it." For 70 years, that gate stood as a boundary between the Mackey family and the rest of the world. It was opened and closed thousands of times by 3 generations of men who understood what it represented. And then strangers started leaving it open, strangers who did not know and did not care about the history or the meaning. To Coleman and Curtis, that carelessness was not just an inconvenience, it was an attack. It was a declaration that their family, their work, their entire lives meant nothing. They could have walked away. They could have accepted that the world did not operate by their rules anymore. But they chose to fight. They chose to make a stand. And it cost them everything. In the end, the question is whether they were right or wrong. And the answer is both. They were right that disrespect and carelessness should have consequences. They were right that the law had failed them. They were right that something precious was being lost as the old ranching culture faded away. But they were wrong in how they responded. They were wrong to believe that violence could restore what time had taken. They were wrong to think that hurting 13 men would somehow protect the legacy they cared about. Instead, it destroyed that legacy. Instead of being remembered as the last of a proud ranching family, they are remembered as criminals, as examples of what happens when you refuse to let go of the past. The ranch is gone. The name is gone. All that remains is a story that most people hear and shake their heads at, unable to understand how something so small could lead to something so terrible. But anyone who has worked the land knows. Anyone who has poured their life into a piece of ground knows what it feels like when someone treats that work as if it means nothing. The anger is real. The sense of violation is real. Coleman and Curtis Mackey were not crazy. They were not evil. They were men who believed in something with a ferocity that the modern world cannot accommodate. They believed that a man's word and a man's fence line were sacred, that respect was the foundation of civilization, that some insults demanded blood. Those beliefs were forged in a harder time, a time when survival depended on maintaining boundaries and enforcing consequences. The brothers carried those beliefs into a softer world, and the collision was catastrophic. They became monsters not because they were born that way, but because they could not bend, could not compromise, could not accept that the code they lived by had become obsolete. Now the land where they lived and died is divided among strangers. The fences are new and straight. The gates have locks. The roads are paved. Everything is clean and modern and empty of history. On quiet evenings, when the wind comes down from the north, you can almost hear the ghost of the old ranch, the sound of cattle moving through the brush, the creak of windmills, the low voices of men who measured their lives in seasons and storms. But those sounds are fading. The people who could hear them are dying off. In another generation, no one will remember what it was like when this was all open range, when a handshake meant something, when a gate was worth fighting for. The Mackey brothers will be forgotten, except as a footnote in the history of Dimmit County, a cautionary tale about the dangers of refusing to change. Their graves will sink into the caliche soil, and the names on the stones will weather away, and eventually even the story will disappear. But for a brief moment they burned bright with rage and pride, and a desperate need to prove that they still mattered, that their way of life still mattered, that the sacrifices of their fathers and grandfathers had not been for nothing. They were wrong. They were right. They were human. and they were destroyed by a broken gate that should never have mattered at all. Sometimes the monsters we fear are not born. They are made, one broken gate at a time.